stage 3, we're adding load. Now, you can use a kettlebell or a dumbbell, whichever you prefer. They both work. I'm going to use a kettlebell for this demonstration for no particular reason whatsoever. It's load, and it's something that I can grab very easily, as you can a dumbbell handle. Now, some people will argue that the load should be held in front of the leg doing the work. Others will say opposite to the leg doing the work. At the end of the day, I can assure you that whichever variation you take, you're going to feel the hamstrings and glutes working. If you're very particular, what I suggest, in however you're tracking your programming, which I encourage this regardless, is specify which variation you're doing, because you might find that loading on the opposite side is very easy for you and you can do them with quite a bit of weight, but when you load in front of the planted foot, you struggle a lot. So that might be something you want to make note of, because it's an evident area of weakness that you can improve on over time. So as you become proficient with one variation, you can still come back to the other variation and know exactly where you left off. Now, same sort of idea. We're going to plant this left foot. I'm going to hold the kettlebell in my right hand. Now, the only thing that's really going to change with this variation, we still want to keep that straight line through from the back of the head to the heel. We still want to focus on hinging at the hips. We still want to try and get the torso and the leg to about parallel with the floor. We want to make sure there's very little movement in that planted leg to ensure maximal stress and prioritization is applied to the hamstrings, glutes, and lower back on that side. What we have to be aware of now is the positioning of this load. We don't want it swinging out in front to help with our balance. We want to aim to keep this load over the center of what would be the midfoot if we had a foot planted there. So, as this kettlebell lowers down, I'm trying to keep it in line, in this particular visual, with my shoelaces. Obviously, there's going to be slight deviation from that midline as you struggle to correct your balance, especially when you're first starting out in phase 3. But that's what you're aiming for. And eventually, you should become quite proficient at keeping that load right over the center of the feet in that general line. I personally keep the kettlebell or the dumbbell that I'm using in line with the leg that is going up in the air, meaning wherever that leg would have been placed, that's where I want that load to be. Personal preference. So my left leg is planted, load is positioned over about the midline of the foot on the opposite side, and very slowly I'm going to raise that foot off the ground, keeping a straight line through from the back of my head through to my heel, lowering down just about parallel with the floor, and very slowly returning back up to a standing position. Brief pause, tapping that right foot off the floor, regaining my positioning, making sure everything is good, and then back off to the races. Again, you'll notice I'm moving deliberately, with control. I'm not trying to race through these to get them done, getting that full range of motion, making sure I'm in control, pausing at parallel before moving back up to a full standing position. Now with phase 3, with the loaded single leg stiff leg deadlift, what you'll find is that the challenge isn't so much the balance anymore. It still might be there, but likely in phase 1 and 2, you've gotten pretty good with your balance. What you need to make sure is those 12 to 15 reps you can execute consecutively. You can maintain that load with the midline of the foot. And the other thing is you want to ensure that you can do this with about 80 to 90% of the weight of the barbell you'll be using for around 12 to 15 repetitions. Now granted, that's not a hard and fast rule, but the reason I bring that particular percentage and rep range into consideration is because when you transition over to the barbell, it's not the same as if you were doing a single arm chest press and you could do 25 pounds in each arm, and now you're going to transition into a 50-pound barbell. Because even though you'll be grabbing that barbell with both hands, that transition into the barbell variation is still a unilateral movement. You're still only using one leg, so the load has to be somewhat relative. But what is something worth noting is that when you do move on to the barbell and you're grabbing it with both hands, it does become a little bit easier to manage the weight because grip fatigue will be a non-factor to the degree that it was when you're holding the load in one hand. So generally speaking, if for example the barbell you're using is a 45-pound bar and you could do single leg deadlifts with good form, quality form, with a 35 for about 12 to 15 reps, you'll likely transition very efficiently into the full barbell. Now this is where things get interesting. This is stage 4, and moving on to a barbell variation, in my opinion, is one of the greatest places to be in when considering unilateral work, simply because barbells can now be micro-loaded. You might find it challenging to work your single leg deadlifts with a 10-pound dumbbell and then jump to a 15 if you don't have access to anything in between. Whereas with a barbell, as many of you know who've watched my content before, I like the fact that we can pull the fractional plates into the game and we can load even half a pound at a time and much more efficiently and effectively manage that volume and load. So let's get into it. Very similar to the dumbbell single leg deadlift, what we're aiming to do here is maintain that straight line through from the back of the head to the heel. We're also aiming to make sure that that planted leg doesn't bend at the knee once the movement has been initiated. The movement comes from hinging at the hips, driving that bum back to the wall behind you. The other thing we want to be aware of is we're aiming to keep that straight line, but we're also trying to get our chest and torso and head parallel to the floor at the bottom end range of motion, and we're aiming to move deliberately and with control. Now, introducing a barbell to the equation, obviously we're going to have some lateral balance issues from side to side because it's a much bigger implement and it is a little bit awkward. But we still want to make sure that we're keeping that barbell over the midline of the foot to the best of our abilities. So let's give it a shot. I personally grab right on the edge of the knurling. Left leg planted, slight bend in the left leg, straight leg reaching back with the heel of the right foot, and we're keeping that bar over the midline of the foot, lowering down, reaching that heel back, relatively straight line through from the back of the head through to the heel of the right leg before returning with control to a full stand. Brief pause, regain balance, make sure everything is good, and then with control, we're moving right into repetition number 2. Keeping that barbell tight to the body and making sure it's not deviating much from the midline of that foot. Once you've made it to stage 4, now you can start experimenting with different rep ranges. So I will not execute single leg stiff leg deadlifts over 6 to 8 reps. Just a personal preference. I'm likely going to stay around the 4 to 6 rep range because I want to focus on developing strength on that single leg positioning. You most certainly can incorporate these for higher rep sets. Nothing's stopping you. Just make sure that you're loading them appropriately and you're progressing with reason. So that's a 4-stage progression that I like to take. Starting with the suspension straps, using them to assist with balance, to become proficient with the proper positioning throughout each repetition and of course the full sets. Once you can do 12 to 15 reps for 3 to 5 sets across, that's significant volume, feel free to transition into phase 2, which is where you practice without the suspension straps. Again, 3 to 5 sets, 12 to 15 repetitions with quality form. You can always videotape yourself to check. Then you can start loading. Start slow, make sure that the loads are manageable. Once you become proficient for 12 to 15 reps with a specific weight, bump it up. Little by little, those little progressions become a lot. And eventually, once you can do about 80 to 90% of the barbell weight that you'll be employing for the barbell single leg stiff leg deadlifts, then transition on over and start building your strength with a barbell. If you've been struggling to master this variation and you found this video informative and useful, please make sure you subscribe or follow depending on what social media platform you might be seeing this on. Further, if you have any training related, nutrition related, or health related questions that you're curious about, feel free to comment, or if you want to keep it private, slide into my DMs and drop me an email.